Hello and welcome to the 7th session of the Massive Open online course for the University of Nicosia's Master's degree in Digital Currencies. This is Andreas Antonopoulos and I'm answering your questions from the previous week. I hope you've had a great week studying. We've got a lot of interesting questions. I apologize a bit for my voice. I'm at a conference in San Francisco, so my video setup and my voice is not in its best condition, but I'll do my best to answer all of your questions coming up. All right. The first question today is about private blockchains, and it comes from Julio. The disadvantages and advantages of private blockchains. Julio says, page 77 states that private blockchain is related to a traditional system due to the concept behind cryptography, but also it's much faster and cheaper. I can understand the advantage of using cryptography, however I can't figure out how a private blockchain can be faster and cheaper. I always thought it would be slower and costlier than a traditional system. Can you please elaborate on that? I think that's a fair point, Julio, and probably the phrasing in that particular part of course isn't as clear as possible. Private blockchains are blockchains that have centralized actors that operate in a closed system where every participant is vetted. So those are called either private blockchains or decentralized ledger technology or something like that. Many of these private blockchains are now being trialed and prototyped for the past 3 or 4 years by various financial services companies, companies in insurance, real estate, and other things, as well as governments trying to build some of the benefits of blockchain into systems, but while maintaining very traditional attitudes towards control and architecture, meaning that these systems are centralized. They're not open, they're not borderless, they're not censorship resistant, they're not neutral, and they're controlled effectively by either a consortium of participants or a single organization or institution. So imagine, for example, that you have a private blockchain for clearing settlement of securities or equities or commodities, or a private blockchain that is for recording real estate transactions that's managed by a government, and it's a closed system. Now, if you think about these, they fall somewhere in between the open public blockchains that started all of this, the cryptocurrencies and other open public blockchains that we're familiar with, and the completely centralized single user, single owner databases of traditional systems that operate in traditional finance, but also in government. So somewhere between SQL, relational databases, and open public blockchains. So how do they compare? In terms of the architecture of control, these are centralized or federated systems, meaning that they either have one controlling entity or they have a number of controlling entities that are either competing or collaborating in some kind of consortium. For example, using multi-signature, proof of authority, various Byzantine fault tolerance, consensus schemes, proof of stake schemes, or things like that. They can have much more simplified consensus algorithms because the federated parties that are the consensus makers of this type of blockchain are trusted parties. So unlike open public blockchains where the system does not depend on trusted parties, private blockchains depend on trusted parties. Now, that's much more centralized than an open public blockchain. So in terms of centralization, they're much closer to a closed and control system that has one owner. But they might be a slight improvement over a traditional system that has one owner by slightly decentralizing that control. Now imagine, for example, you have an equity system where there is a clearinghouse, for example, the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, DTCC, that does clearing of all of the equities. That's a single organization that manages that process in a closed proprietary system. Other people have visibility, but they don't have control. Ultimately, that control lies with DTCC and a trusted party for that. Now, imagine replacing that system with a federated clearing system where you have 5, 10, 15 participants in the market acting as the consensus makers for a federated system. So 15 is better than 1. It's more decentralized, but it's still fairly centralized. Now, if you compare the performance, obviously the performance of a federated consensus blockchain with cryptography versus a relational database, a SQL database, is going to be much worse. It's a much more complex technology. The scaling characteristics are much more difficult. One controlling owner to a handful or a dozen controlling owners, at the cost of reducing the performance of the system dramatically by turning it into a blockchain or a distributed ledger technology. But if you compare that, a federated system with 15 consensus makers, to a completely open, public, trustless consensus algorithm such as the Bitcoin blockchain, obviously this private blockchain is much faster than the Bitcoin blockchain because it sacrifices decentralization. It sacrifices immutability, openness, borderless operation, neutrality, and censorship resistance. All of those properties are gone because it's effectively centralized than a single owner. A lot less performance than a relational database, a lot less decentralized than an open public blockchain, and losing many of the properties of open, borderless, immutable, auditable, neutral, censorship resistant operation, but much better performance than an open public blockchain because it sacrifices all of those principles to achieve them. So that's where they fall, somewhere on that spectrum. To me, these systems are not particularly interesting because they're only an incremental innovation on the traditional control architectures of highly centralized systems. They may slightly improve markets and operating margins and trust in some systems that are really quite broken, corrupt, and opaque today. But my interest is primarily on the open public blockchains because they have these additional features. By maximizing the degree of decentralization and opening the systems up, they offer borderless operation. They can be completely global. They're neutral to the nature of transactions. The sort of result, they bring these principles. They're very different, which creates a very powerful paradigm that doesn't exist already. Private blockchains, what they do already exists, and they make a small change to that model, and that's really the comparison. All right, let's try this again. My sincere apologies. We had a number of technical problems, including the Wi-Fi at the hotel where I'm at getting completely overwhelmed because everybody woke up and jumped on Wi-Fi and crashed the Wi-Fi at the hotel, and I was disconnected for a full 10 minutes, and unfortunately, that's it. I know you missed some of the last question or answer that I provided. I have a local recording, so we'll be able to reconstruct that, edit it, and produce the video so you can rewatch the sections that you missed. But let's proceed again. Hopefully, you are able to both see and hear me now, and we can continue with your questions. The next question comes from George Gontikas about the anonymity features of Monero and cleaning up your Bitcoin tracks with Monero. This is a common question and a common theme, which is using privacy coins in connection with coins that have less privacy to effectively increase the privacy set of your transactions, to increase the privacy quality of your transaction by essentially exchanging or swapping from a less private currency to a more private currency and then back. This comes up a lot, which is the idea that if you exchanged, for example, Bitcoin to Monero and then back to Bitcoin, would that clean up the privacy of your Bitcoin and make it impossible to follow the history of the transactions? Well, theoretically, yes. Practically, that's very difficult to do, and also in many countries illegal. So you need to be very aware that even if you're doing this purely for your own personal privacy, well, that may be acceptable in some countries, it may not be acceptable in other countries. But the bottom line is it depends on a number of factors, including how you transfer one cryptocurrency to another and what characteristics they have. If you use, for example, a centralized custodian exchange to do this transfer, then obviously the transactions are going to get tracked on both ends. And as a result, you haven't really achieved anything. If you were able to do this with an atomic swap or decentralized exchange or some other mechanism directly blockchain to blockchain without a third-party custodian, then what would happen is you'd be able to disconnect the first transaction from the last transaction. However, when you use a cryptocurrency that doesn't have strong privacy like Bitcoin, and that cryptocurrency has been previously exchanged on a decentralized exchange or using a coin join or using some other privacy protecting mechanism like that, what will happen is exchanges will most likely not accept those coins, and various merchants will not accept those coins. So companies that do blockchain surveillance, they call it chain analytics, but it's basically blockchain surveillance, provide information on risk rating to exchanges and merchants in various countries where these transactions are regulated and where exchanges and merchants need to follow various know your customer and anti-money laundering regulations, etc., etc. As a result, if they look at a Bitcoin amount that you're trying to, for example, send to an exchange to trade or pay for something to buy something from a merchant that is using these surveillance technologies, what will happen is that Bitcoin will be tracked backwards several transactions back to see where it came from. And usually within 3 hops, there's going to be another exchange, which is one of the trusted addresses or wallets in the system, and they'll be like, okay, so it got checked there, so it should be okay now. If you go back 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hops or whatever, and you end up in an atomic swap with Monero, or you end up in a decentralized exchange, or you end up in a coin join transaction, the surveillance companies will score that as risky. They'll basically score that Bitcoin as having an origin that they cannot determine, and if they can't determine it's good, by definition, it's not good. So the way the mechanism works is it's not just transactions that are related to something actually bad, like, oh, this was stolen from an exchange, or this is money that came from a hack, or it's been flagged by someone, whatever. They work in the opposite ways. Like, if we can trace it back to a trusted party, like I'm going to tell the exchange, this is high risk because we don't know. So not knowing is the same as bad, effectively. And as a result, your Bitcoin that came out would be anonymous, but it would also be tainted. It would be tainted with anonymity, meaning that it would be considered high risk because it came from a source of strong anonymity. And that's really the mechanism that's in use today to ensure that surveillance is enforced and that privacy is minimized. Effectively, what that means is that if you want to use open public cryptocurrencies, those with or without privacy mechanisms, and you want to maintain your privacy, you cannot use them with the traditional financial system. You can't use them on exchanges. You can't use them with merchants who are doing these kinds of surveillance technologies. You have to use them only for direct transactions with other people. And that's up to you if you want to do that, and if it's legal in your country, that's a question that's outside the scope of this course. All right, hopefully we are back now. I'm just going to do a quick check. All right, we are back. So thank you for your patience. I apologize. This is the nature of doing live streaming from everywhere in the world. If you think about it, the very fact that we can even sometimes do it with somewhat decent quality is a miracle of modern engineering and would be impossible even 10 years ago. So let's all smile about that and continue. Luis asks about the average confirmation time of different consensus algorithms. Is it possible to say that the average time frame within which a confirmation is attained, block times, is the same in all cryptocurrencies, or are there differences depending on the consensus algorithm? Luis, it is very different from blockchain to blockchain. And the confirmation time, finality, as it's more generally known in the consensus algorithm conversations, because not all things have blocks and not all things use confirmations, and various consensus algorithms use slightly different terminology because they operate slightly differently. The generic term for this is finality, basically settlement that occurs when a transaction is either final to a certain probability. Bitcoin is a probabilistic finality system, which means the more confirmations you have, the more certain you are it can't be reversed, and that probability increases by the equation that you see on page 8 of the Bitcoin white paper. Other blockchains have different characteristics of finality, and the times for settlement vary dramatically. So for example, Ethereum has 15 to 30 second block times, but in order to actually get finality, the number of blocks that have to elapse is much higher because they're coming along much faster, and you can have reorganizations in that network that are for a greater number of blocks because of the speed of block confirmation. So again, a different set of trade-offs. The longer the time between blocks, the less you have collisions that create orphans on the network. Orphan blocks are conditions where two people discover a block almost simultaneously across different parts of the network, and then there is a temporary divergence where two parts of the network think that a different child has been mined to the same parent, and then 2 blocks later the chain reconverges based on the fact that it's unlikely for that to keep happening, where people keep finding 2 blocks simultaneously at different parts of the network. That happens in Bitcoin, and the 10-minute block time is carefully timed or selected by Satoshi Nakamoto as a balance between how many orphans are generated, which is on average once a week or once every 2 weeks. A block is orphaned because of this normal reconvergence of the network. Because 2 miners happen to find a block almost simultaneously in different parts of the network. when you decrease that time, then you're going to generate a lot more of these orphans, and that's a trade-off that Ethereum has made, for example, with its proof of work algorithm and its very fast confirmation time of 15 to 30 seconds. But it handles things differently by using the orphans, the orphan blocks, and rewarding not just one block winner takes all, but a mechanism that rewards uncles, as they're called. And I may be getting the terminology wrong, so I apologize for that. But the general concept is that a different set of trade-offs and some different tuning parameters allow Ethereum to do a lot more blocks a lot faster, but then in order to get finality, the number of blocks you have to wait is not 6 as in Bitcoin, but a lot more. So depending on what people are expecting, depending on the application, it might be 25, it might be 100. Some cryptocurrencies talk about, instantaneous confirmation or things like that. Claims that need to be taken with a grain of salt. With all of these things, there are trade-offs, and the trade-offs have to do with the degree of decentralization of the network, the expectations the network has in terms of connectivity and latency and bandwidth requirements, the degree of concentration of nodes and things like that. But yes, cryptocurrencies and blockchains basically exhibit very, very different timing characteristics. And so you need to understand, under the timing characteristics of the blockchain you're operating on, what it means to have finality, what are the criteria by which you have finality, how long does that take, what is the probability of a reversal if it's a probabilistic finality, and how long do you need to wait before you ship the Lambo, basically, or ship the flat screen TV, or let the customer walk out with a very expensive piece of jewelry after you've received X confirmations. And so the answer that you would give for Bitcoin is different than the answer that you would give for Monero, Dash, or Ethereum, or whatever other nano, whatever other blockchain you're operating in. You cannot assume that it's the same. You cannot assume that what means finality on one blockchain is the same as another. David asks about winner takes all in smart contracts. I think that in the money, store, or value, there can be various competing coins depending on your preferences on time, security, and anonymity. But when using smart contracts, why would Ethereum, Hyperledger, EOS, Neo coexist? Wouldn't it be more feasible to use the cheapest and most robust blockchain available? This is a very controversial question, and my opinion on this is probably very controversial too. This is about the competition within a narrow application niche within the blockchain space. If you define money, store, and value, and you assume there are many competing coins based on time, preference, security, anonymity, etc., in practice, while there are competing coins for that space, and then in the smart contract space, in practice, there are competing coins for that space. If you look at the metrics of these coins, they exhibit a strong Pareto distribution. And a Pareto distribution, or power law distribution, is where you have a concentration of most of the metrics in a handful of winners. It's not winner takes all as in one winner takes all, but what you have is a cluster of winners, maybe 3 or 4, that have the lion's share. You might have one dominant system that has 40, 50, 60, 70% of the transactions, the market capitalization, the number of users, the number of applications, the number of developers. Pick any metric, and you chart it against all of the competitors in that niche, and you're going to come up with a power law. And the classic shape of a power law is a hump at the front, and then it drops quickly, and then it has a very, very long tail. The long tail concept, which has been talked about in technology for a long time. It comes out in nature again and again. Many different physical processes create these power law distributions. So in a power law distribution, you may have what's more commonly known, the 80-20 rule. 20% of the of the systems have 80% of the transactions. That's the layperson's kind of rule of thumb that expresses a power law, or one type, shape of a power law. You could assume that there might be 1, 2, or 3 dominant systems that have 90% of the activity, of which one of them has 70% of the activity. But then there's another 100 systems that share the last 5%. That's happening in every cryptocurrency niche, in every blockchain niche, and in blockchain space as a whole in the entire market. You see this power law happening again and again. If you look at all of the blockchains, they're a power law. If you take just the blockchains that are mostly money store value, they're a power law. If you see the ones that are smart contracts, they're a power law too. So yes, it would be feasible to use the cheapest, most robust blockchain available, just like in the case of sound money store value type blockchains. It would make sense for all of the value to converge on a single, the most robust, most secure, and not some, not 70%, not 75%, not even 8%, all 100%, and everything else dies. That is effectively what's the maximalist position. There are degrees of maximalism that you see in all of these conversations, and one degree of maximalism is just 100%. All of the other things go to zero, and one survives and has 100% of all of the transactions and all of the activity, either within each niche, or for the maximally maximalist, one coin to rule them all, one chain to rule them all. And I don't think that happens. In fact, I think what we see again and again is these power law distributions. Now, the interesting question is, what shape does this power law distribution have? Is it a fairly steep power law where a lot of the value is concentrated in one or maybe two chains, more than 80%, and then with a long tail but very, very fast decline? So the first and second, maybe third coin have 90% of everything. Or maybe the first one has 70-80% of everything, and then the second has 20, and then the rest are all in the single digits and fractional percentages. Or is it a more flat curve, where the dominant system has 40% or 50%, and the next 5 share another 20-30% between them, and then there's a very massive long tail of little systems that have 1, 2, 3%. So if you look at the different power laws that emerge in our industry, you'll see both the very steep ones, you'll also see more flat ones. And even in the layout between the different blockchains over time, Bitcoin has gone down in terms of its market dominance. These metrics are very difficult to measure because you've got to consider how much of it is actually liquid, how much is actually tradable, how much of it is actually used on the system versus just sitting locked up in addresses and not moving. But if you just take them at face value, we've seen these metrics, even the crude metrics, fluctuate from the low 60s to the high 80s. And at one time, of course, Bitcoin had 100% of the market cap because nothing else existed. So we've seen these curves get steeper and flatter. I don't think that you end up with one winner takes all, but I do think you get these examples of very dominant systems that occupy a very big chunk of the market. And the reason they do is not just because economic considerations, the cheapest, most robust, most secure, best sound money, whatever, not just because of rational reason and rational considerations. First of all, you're going to have non-economic factors, such as the number of developers, the number of libraries, the affinity to programming languages that have a lot of developers, the market conditions, the culture fit in a specific country, or things like that. And so it's going to vary a lot. And then you're also going to have non-financial but also non-rational considerations for the adoption and use of these things, because people have emotional affinity and attachment to these ideas. They like something about it and will continue to use it because they like it, even if it's not the best, the fastest, the cheapest, the most robust. Dogecoin is still around for a reason. And so if you take all of these factors into consideration, that creates more of the diversity and flatter power law distributions, because people do not simply rationally and coldly decide to pursue one set of interests in a pure financial way. And also because a lot of these systems have all of these trade-offs that differentiate them enough that there are all kinds of other reasons why people would make different choices for their applications, for the development environment, for the programming languages they use, for the libraries, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So for all of those reasons, winner takes all, no. Winner takes most, yes. We are seeing that. Winner takes most for now happens again and again, and it happens both in the industry as a whole, with Bitcoin dominating for a decade now, and it happens in each one of the niches. For example, in the smart contract space, Ethereum is the winner takes most blockchain at the moment. That doesn't mean it's the best. I'm not making an assessment of why it takes most. That's a market deciding based on a number of variables that may not be visible to everyone. So that's how it plays out, in my opinion. All right, and let's go to the final set of questions we have in the last few minutes. We're going to talk about anti-money laundering and cryptocurrencies. This is a topic that comes up with a spontaneous question in the live chat forum in the previous Q&A, which a lot of the students were very interested in answering. But while it is an extremely interesting topic, anti-money laundering, it isn't part of the course material. It doesn't fall cleanly into any of the MOOC's course material, although as part of the master's degree there are a number of topics that are more tied to regulatory and economic issues. But in terms of the MOOC, it doesn't quite fit. But since a lot of people asked, we're going to use this opportunity to elaborate a bit on the idea of anti-money laundering. So AML, or anti-money laundering, is a framework of regulations that exists both at the international level, the national level, and the local level in most countries. So for example, in the US, there are frameworks that exist at the state level, there are frameworks that exist at the federal level, and the same thing applies in Europe, the same thing applies in other countries. There's also international frameworks, European-wide frameworks that have to do with participation in various international networks, like the wire transfer network that's operated by SWIFT, etc., etc. A counter to that anti-money laundering is CTF, which stands for counter-terrorist financing, which is effectively a more focused set of regulations, specifically focused on the idea of interrupting funding of terrorism by controlling flows of money. Again, this is a very controversial topic, partly because of the political considerations that exist here. My personal opinion is that anti-money laundering is a system that has horrendous side effects in creating conditions of poverty and economic exclusion for billions of people around the world, while delivering very, very few benefits in tangible results, primarily because the ability of criminals to bypass these regulations by corrupting the banking system, corrupting the very regulators who are supposed to be checking these things, and using a number of means that are outside of the purview of anti-money laundering, not cryptocurrencies, but commodity laundering that happens, just keeps increasing every year. The vast majority of it is not interrupted. None of it has much to do with cryptocurrencies, because that's not really a way that people do money laundering or terrorism financing. And of course, the political challenges are that in many cases, of course, money laundering is done by banks because they have money. And so a lot of money laundering is about preventing people who acquire banking licenses and access to the banking system from buying and using banks to launder their money, just like many cartels and other criminal organizations have done in the past. If you want to money launder, you buy yourself a bank and you have them do it for you. And of course, banks keep getting prosecuted for this. They get a slap on the wrist, they get a fine, and they move on. Same issue with counterterrorism financing, of course, which is that the vast majority of terrorist activity is funded by nation states, intelligence agencies, and is funded with fiat, gold, oil, and direct transfers by governments. So, the idea that the laundromat down the corner that is being... Now let's talk about the relationship between these regulations and cryptocurrencies. I seem to have a signal problem, but I'll just continue and we'll try to get that in the recording. So in every country, the government applies different rules to the financial system under the three-part system. KYC, which stands for Know Your Customer, which basically is a set of regulations introduced by the Bank Secrecy Act, which have been adopted pretty much worldwide, that require banks to know what the customers are doing, why they're doing it, what the purpose of the transaction is, what kind of businesses they're running, what are their patterns of spending and things like that, and then report things that they deem suspicious with suspicious activity reports, or SARs. So there's a lot of acronyms here. KYC, Know Your Customer, SAR, Suspicious Activity Report. You may know that there are some thresholds like, if you do more than $10,000, they're going to send a report and tell the IRS or tell the regulators, hey, this business or this person did more than X. Every country it's a different amount, but that's the mandatory reporting. But of course the entire system requires a voluntary reporting of anything that's suspicious. So banks are supposed to report things even if they don't reach that amount, but simply because they seem to be different from the pattern they expect. They have to do anti-money laundering, which means understanding whether their customers are trying to structure transactions or wash money by removing any connection between money that's received or used for illicit purposes and money that's used for legitimate business purposes, however that's defined in each legal jurisdiction under whatever mesh of laws exists, and of course finally counterterrorism financing, or CTF. The way these rules apply to cryptocurrencies is that they are enforced on all of the exchanges and the banks that support the exchanges with fiat bank accounts. So if you are an exchange, in order to be able to do fiat exchange, you have to have a bank account. If you have a bank account, your bank applies the regulations to you, but it also requires that you apply as an exchange those same regulations to your own customers. This is pretty much standard across the world. So all exchanges have to do the fundamental regulatory compliance things of know your customer, which means identifying and verifying the identity, address, photo ID, etc., of their customers, preventing money laundering and preventing terrorism financing based on various lists and blacklists and names that they have to follow. What this does, of course, is it means it prevents many of the people who have a need to use cryptocurrencies because they are insufficiently documented, because they live in places where the banking system doesn't operate well or is corrupt, or their government is suppressing their ability to be participant in the economy, etc., etc. So in that case, in the crypto economy, you don't use fiat. If you do transactions within the cryptocurrency economy directly from person to person, only in cryptocurrency without exchanging fiat, then effectively, if you're just doing these as an individual, in most countries you are not subject to any of these regulations. Just like if I give $10 to a homeless person, I don't need to ask them for ID. If I buy bananas from a roadside stall, and give them money for bananas. I don't need to ask them for ID. There might be some regulations if you employ people, obviously, and things like that. So if you hire people and pay them, then you may be subject to some regulations, but you certainly don't have, as an individual, or even in most cases as a business, if you're not in the banking, any obligation to track or report suspicious activity. However, in some countries, as an individual or a company, you have obligations to prevent transmitting money to people who are on the naughty list. So for example, as a US citizen, if you operate in the US, or if you're a US citizen who operates outside of the US, you are subject to regulations that require you to prevent, that make it illegal, in fact, for you to send money to a person who, or a company that is listed on the Treasury Department's OFAC list. So normally a bank does that for you. So if you try to do a wire transfer to pay someone for publishing your book in Russia, to use an example that is very not hypothetical, your bank is going to say, well, who are these people? What do they do? Oh, it's a publishing, okay, who owns the publishing company? Is it one of these, 1,000 people who are listed on the sanctions list for Russia or whatever? And then gradually provide all of the documentation, or the other person provides all the documentation, and your bank verifies that in fact it is okay to send money to that person. Now imagine a scenario where instead of sending money through the banking system, I were to pay someone in Mexico, or pay someone even in the US with cryptocurrency. And I have an obligation to check that the person I'm paying is not on the OFAC list as a private individual, which means I have to check every single time I make a payment to a business partner, or a translator, or a video editor, or one of my contractors, or someone who wants to send me a t-shirt and I want to buy the t-shirt. I have to check their name and their company and make sure that the person I'm sending money to is not, type in their name, type in the company name, is not listed as someone I cannot send money to. So some of these regulations apply to people making transactions regardless of whether you're a regulated entity. Essentially, individuals are a regulated entity in the United States, specifically for the counterterrorism financing purposes and anti-money laundering purposes on the sanctions list. Other countries may have similar restrictions like this. So while there is no mechanism within cryptocurrency to enforce these things, while there is no monitoring of identity within the blockchain, while many of these things have the capability of being pseudonymous or fully anonymous or strongly private, the regulations may still apply to the individuals doing these transactions. And of course, the problem with this is that when these transactions are recorded on the blockchain, they're recorded forever, and years from now, one of these addresses becomes identified as belonging to someone, and then all of the other transactions that happened from that address can then become identified as belonging to someone. So even years after you do a transaction, the analytics and surveillance mechanisms that operate on the blockchain may catch up with new information and basically reveal information about your transaction. And if that transaction